This is the High-Stakes Lowdown, a RotoViz podcast brought to you by the Fantasy Football Players Championship. I'm Eric Balkman from the High-Stakes Fantasy Football Hour and the FFPC. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Balkman and the FFPC on Twitter at FFPC. Before we get into the show, I want to remind everyone that you can get a listeners-only 10% discount to RotoViz by using the code RVRadio2022. That's RVRADIO2022. Your subscription gives you unlimited access to all of the RotoViz content and tools, and it supports the podcast channel. Now, without further ado, here's the latest edition of the RotoViz High-Stakes Lowdown. Hi, hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the RotoViz High-Stakes Lowdown. I am your host, Eric Balkman. You know me from the High-Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, the Fantasy Football Players Championship, and of course, the High-Stakes Fantasy Football Show over on the Better Sports Network. Connect with me on the X at Eric Balkman, EricBalkman. It is the Season 9 finale here tonight as we are bringing you content weekly throughout drafting and it's drafting season and the NFL season itself. I will give you a programming note on what's going to happen in season 10 coming up here later on at the end of the show. If you are looking for some fun, looking for some action, maybe the playoff challenge didn't treat you right in the wild card round and you're drawing dead, doesn't matter because we got the FFPC Divisional Playoff Challenge. The FFPC Playoff Challenge 2 was live. You could take your shot at a $100,000 grand prize or a $25,000 grand prize if you want to play for $200 or $35 entry fee. Those are the grand prizes there. 8 players. You are not fading anybody. You are picking one player from each of the remaining 8 playoff teams. Standard lineup, quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, tight end, and flex. That is what you're looking at here. The winner will be the person who has the most total points over the next 3 weekends of football, of NFL football, and double points to anybody who is playing in the big game on Super Sunday. That is what's going on over at myffpc.com, myffpc.com. That's where to go. As long as you're there, and if you are a Dynasty player, and I know we're into Dynasty season here, plenty of orphans available from $77 all the way up to $2,500. If you want to pick up a Dynasty orphan team and play fantasy football 365 days a year, just go to myffpc.com/dynasty and click on the orphan link. That'll bring up all the teams, and you can buy it with the click of a button and add that to your fantasy football portfolio. Speaking of fantasy football portfolios, we have a guest tonight who has a big one. He is a player who's been playing, I want to say about 7 years now. I think 7 years with the FFPC, and a guy in his 7 years has won, count them, 162 FFPC leagues over the years. He has done very well in some of the highest stakes leagues that we offer as well. You follow him on the X at Daniel Priestner. Please welcome in my guest for tonight, Mr. Daniel Priestner. Daniel, welcome in. Good evening. How are you?
I'm fantastic, Eric. Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be joining you for the final episode of the season.
Yeah, it's good. It's hard because I love doing this show on Tuesday nights. Always talking to really brilliant FFPC fantasy players like yourself. And we're still going to be doing a show. It's just going to be, it won't be weekly going forward into the offseason. More on that to come. How did, and you did, by the way, a fantastic job. We're exchanging some emails. You developed enough content, I think, for 2 shows in those emails, and I want to touch on as much as we can. Blanket question to start off. The regular season of fantasy football is now over. It ended with week 17. How was 2024 as a whole for you this year for fantasy football?
Well, honestly, Eric, I would sum it up as disappointing. I've come over, a 7-year period to kind of, I guess, have high expectations of myself, especially on the dynasty side. I think on the season-long side, I'd say I'm not quite as adept as on the dynasty side, but in the dynasty world, I feel pretty strongly about my portfolio, and I feel like it's kind of a yearly moneymaker, so to speak, as long as I manage it right. I have a partner who Rob Walsh, who helps me manage a good chunk of that portfolio, and he's a really sharp guy, makes great trades. and has great input on the rookie draft and all that kind of stuff. So I think our portfolio over the years has proven fairly profitable. This year, sadly, week 15 was just one of those kind of almost comedy of errors type of weeks where everything went wrong for me and for Rob. And only 20% of our dynasty teams advanced through that week 15 all play. And typically that number for us is more like 65%. And so that really eliminated most of our expected upside this year out of the dynasty teams. Thankfully, had a lot of first and second place buys and had a lot of teams that did make the finals do well. So that was good. And so finished strong, but was disappointed. On the redraft side, had a really huge near miss in the 5K big payback in that week 15. Still kicking myself. Rob told me to play Rob told me to play Laporta. I played Thielen. Goff threw the ball 60 times in the dome, and it was Thielen's, I think, worst game in 6 weeks that he had there without a touchdown. And that cost that 10 points, I think, or 11 points it was. I still remember. Ended up costing me and Rob the big payback. And the gentleman who made it through because of our mistake. Honestly, I didn't check his lineup that closely. He may have made a similar mistake, and maybe it's all for naught. But we thought we had that 5K licked, and then the gentleman who made it through that all play ended up getting the win of the 25 grand. And so our team would have won week 16, 17, but we didn't make it through. Had one other big, quite a near miss, but the 10K we played live down in Vegas, and our team didn't quite have the steam. We finished 7th, just missed the playoffs, but week 16, 17, we were the highest scoring team. So I'd like to think we had something right there in the 10K, but didn't quite get to the playoffs, so couldn't make it materialize.
You know, and people who have watched this show before, they've heard me tell this story a couple of times. Week 15 for me, this wasn't as big of a deal as it was for you, but I told people on that Friday's High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour, if you are playing Jaden Daniels or Jared Goff, if you're deciding between the two, I would definitely play Goff over Daniels. And then I had to make that decision in one of my leagues, and I had Goff in there, and with about 10 minutes to go, I made the change for Daniels, who had a good week, but not nearly as good of a week as Goff. And that cost me probably, I think I said about 20 spots on the KFFSC main event leaderboard, which stinks, but it happens, right? We have those weeks. When you talk about your dynasties this year, week 15 was what you did not run good in week 15. Was it just a bunch of weird stuff that happened that singular week, or was it a bigger problem that prevented you?
A few bad starts at decisions, and a few just a few bad breaks. Our guys that we were on just didn't quite perform that week that we had, I'd say, a higher percentage of within our portfolio in total. Jalen Waddle, I think we have a lot of Waddle. Obviously, he had a bad year across the board. I thought in week 15 there was a few really close decisions with Waddle. I think he posted a 0. And I think I picked him over a couple of guys that were real close that probably put up 10 or 15. A lot of little decisions like that really cost us in week 15.
The other thing I'll bring up with Dynasty, the $5,000 Dynasty League in the FFPC, you are now back-to-back champion of that league. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's been a good one for sure. Kind of kept the portfolio moving, obviously, the last 2 years. Hit right on the startup. Last year got Kyron Williams in like the 15th round or something. And Henry, Kamara, and just the running backs have just been smashing CeeDee Lamb. So that team's done well 2 years in a row. Just barely held off Paul Dietzman, the cat-like reflexes there. He came charging at me. We were emailing each other in the last few hours of that, heading into the end of that, because we both wanted that win pretty bad.
Dynasty in general, I don't want to spend a whole lot, but we could spend a couple of minutes on it. Do you have any bylaws, the Priestner bylaws that you subscribe to on things you have to do in Dynasty in regards to team management in season, team management off season, hoarding rookie picks, trading rookie picks, getting veterans on your team? Do you have anything that rules that you subscribe to for all your Dynasty leagues that you think is not only the right thing to do, but proved profitable for you over the years?
Well, the first thing for me is I tend to really only want to play teams that are going to be likely winners. If I've mismanaged a team, or maybe I took an orphan on or something, I might let that team go again, kind of in the future, looking for a better opportunity. Other than a startup where I might try to collect firsts once in a while, But even in the case where I'm collecting first, I'm still going to grab late values like a Mike Evans or Stephon Diggs or Cooper Kupp, or guys who just seemed to be going a little bit late, who could hit later in their careers, and still try to go after the playoffs. And then if I am in a position to make the playoffs and I have 4 firsts out of a startup, then I'll trade a few of those firsts, try to load the team up, and then get ready for a playoff run. So try to leave my options open. But hard and fast rule, the only real one is I only want to play teams that I think can win. And so I'll almost sometimes evaluate a dynasty team more from a redraft standpoint, where even if it only has a chance to win this one last year, I'm still going to play that team if I think it's got a good chance to win.
Interesting.
Where a lot of people would try to sell that team early. I'm not usually getting out of those guys. I'll just die with the Derrick Henry if I have to. I'm not going to trade him for I'm not trading him for a second round pick. You're just never going to find me do that.
You and I are of one mind on that, because I will collect these veterans, and I've been bringing this up for 10 plus years. Hines Ward is the reason I do it, because Hines Ward, it was a guy I was ready to give up on, let him go for like a second or a third round pick. And dude had like 3 or 4 wide receiver 2 seasons after that. Like, you know what I mean? So it's like, those players, man, I feel like I'm never going to get the right value for them. Maybe I overvalue them, but yeah, I've had Tyler Lockett on a couple of my dynasty teams, and he might hang it up after this season, or he might be ready to do it right now. And if that's the case, I'll release him in good faith. Like he's been great for me. I'm not in the position to move on. I always say I'm the bag holder, right? Because I'll be holding that veteran bag at the end of his career, and I'll just move on from there. I think that's the way to do it.
I agree totally.
In regards to the rookie class, at what point do you start looking at rookies and scouting rookies? Is it March, April, May? When do you start with your research on that?
I get a little more deeply involved, probably I'd say about a month out from now. Once the Super Bowl's finished, I pretty much pivot directly into that kind of stuff right away.
And are you a film guy? Are you reading what other pundits have to say about it? How do you prep for that?
Definitely not a film guy, more of an analytics guy. A few people that I really trust, Rob being one of them, is more of a film guy, and he looks at stuff on the all-22s and watches some of these guys a little closer than I do. So I take a lot of his advice on the rookies coming in. I also, there's a couple of obviously really great sites out there that I do subscribe to and pay attention to what they're saying on the rookies. Somebody like JJ Zacharyson, I'll call that out. He's a guy I think over the years has been just spot on. Obviously, nobody's perfect, but I think his record's really solid, and I watch him really closely during the offseason with rookies. Yeah,
I've had him on the Better Sports Network show that I do a few times, and he is as dialed in as anybody can get. And I'm with you as far as rookies go. He is spot on with almost all of his stuff, much better than the average. I can tell you that.
I haven't missed one of his podcasts in probably 6 years.
Really good for you. No, see, that's one thing. What I don't know about you in regards to podcasts. I know a lot of people. Scott Connor, Dynasty and Chill. He is the king at this. Where he'll listen, he will grind through like 40 podcasts in like a day, like where he's just like, and he's listening at like 2x speed. I have to listen 1x. I can't do 1.5 or 1.25. I have to do 1x. Do you ever, is that something that you ever do, is speed it up so you can, get the content in your brain faster?
A few years ago, I was trying to play DFS. That didn't prove to be profitable, and I got away from that. I just play it as, I throw in $25 in the millionaire here and there just to see if I can hit something. But I don't really spend much money there anymore. But when I was probably at the time overloaded because I was listening to Dynasty and DFS at the same time. I found myself on 1.5x. And I got to a point I was listening to actually do a JJ podcast, and he talks pretty fast when he goes through his numbers. And he was talking too fast for me to actually keep up with what he was saying, and he gets really into the analytics. So I had to slow him down to a 1. And then from there, I quit DFS seriously and just decided to focus on Dynasty. And when I did that, I cut down my podcast time. But I am more like Scott. I would, my wife will always tell me, why do you have those stupid earbuds in your ears? I'm always listening to somebody's fantasy football podcast. It's usually 2 or 3 people that I trust the most, like JJ.
Yeah. And I know JJ too, like when you talk about the speed that he speaks, you put that on 2x, man, he starts sounding like the Chipmunks, like Alvin and the Chipmunks.
Yeah, like, for
sure. For sure. Dom Gazzetti hanging out in the YouTube chat right now. He wants to know, is this full time for you, fantasy football and running all these high stakes and season long teams? How much do you spend on it a week?
Oh, thanks, Dominic, for asking. I appreciate that. No, definitely not full time. I have a full time job. Actually, I'm the president and chief relationship officer of Canada One Auto, which is one of the largest auto groups in Canada. We've got 42 dealerships across the country. That's franchise rooftops like Toyota, General Motors, Ford, and whatnot. So that's what I do day to day. That's a 50 or 60 hour a week job. Thankfully, I have a lot of really good people around me who work even a lot longer hours than I do, and put a ton of time into the business and have a lot of heart and soul. And so our business is doing really well. This has become sort of a side job. My wife will tell you again that this is definitely a part-time job. That's for sure. And so, a lot of my time that I find that I have free, which isn't a lot these days, is I have a 7 and a 5-year-old boy getting into sports, and that's really eaten into my free time. But the free time I do have, I spend it on podcasts, fantasy football, and dynasty management.
There you go. What a life, a full life, family, great job, and fantasy football. You got it made.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I have no doubt. We will talk about, and I think we'll hop into various things tonight. But the one thing I want to kind of focus on as the prevailing topic is the FFPC Playoff Challenge 2. Now, before we get into that, you have several teams in the playoff challenge, both at the $200 and the $35 level. And when you talk about the several teams that you filled out for the playoff challenge to try to win $500,000, they're fairly unique, right? Can you talk a little bit about, not necessarily all the players on them, but how you constructed them and where you think they stack up after the first weekend of play?
Happy to. Yeah. I put 5 entries into the $200 contest. I only put a couple into the 35. I find the 35 to be just a little bit too much of a lottery for me, where I really feel like I start to go off the board. I'm starting to think about, should I play Marvin Mims? And when I'm doing that, I'm starting to think I'm probably not going to have much of a chance to win, even if I do kind of hit something pretty good. Even if I'm in the 80th or 90th percentile, I'm not likely to win much. So I focused on the $200 contest. And I think it was 7,500 entries or something along those lines. And so I felt like if I could hit something unique in that, I'd be a lot more likely to have a chance to win number one. One of the keys there is obviously not having a duplicated lineup. You don't want to be splitting prizes, especially if it's a 3, 4, 10. I saw 16, I think, X duplicated in the 200 contest and 31X lineup duplicated in the 35. So there's a lot of dupes, and kind of like a DFS showdown contest. You don't want to run a DFS showdown lineup that's going to be duplicated a ton of times, and you end up winning the thing, and you only win, $3,500 instead of $150,000,
right?
Because 200, however many people are splitting that prize a million different ways, and so it's kind of that old concept of what do you win when you win. And so I took that into the challenge number 1. I've never had a ton of success, frankly, in the FFC playoff challenge, but I put a little more thought into it this year, and I was pretty happy to find out post lock that all 5 of my teams were purely unique. And I really don't feel like I went off the board. Like, I didn't play any fringy Marvin Mims type plays. I had guys like Joe Mixon, Kieran Williams, who have a chance, equally to put up as many points as a Nico Collins or a Puka Nacua, who are a lot chalkier. And so felt pretty good about how I built those lineups. And also, to me, the quarterback position was the difference last week. I haven't quite got a handle on the quarterback position for tournament 2, but in week 1, it was clear it was Josh and it was Lamar. And I just woke up in the morning and was like, is it not obvious that KC is likely to win the Super Bowl? Like, don't I want Patrick Mahomes in this contest and just get through week 1 without a quarterback? And so I started all my lineups with Mahomes. And then when I did my research, I realized he was going to be like 6%. And I thought, well, I'm on the right track here. I'm sticking with Mahomes. I did realize Jalen Hurts was going to be low owned as he's coming off the concussion, and everyone seemed to forget how good he is, and that I thought Philly's likely to win the NFC. So I went with Mahomes and I went with Hurts, both really low-owned quarterbacks. So that started all my teams off in terms of being fairly contrarian right away. And then it was picks like Mixon and Kyron, who were like 14 and 18% owned against much higher percentage guys in their own teams who did well in week 1. I'm not in a great position because there's a lot of kickers and defense, that did well, that advanced, Houston, like the Rams. And so those teams are right now at the top of the board. But I think with a quarterback now, and with 8 live players and no kicker in defense, I think I have a pretty good chance to jump up the board. That said, there could be somebody who's got me on week 1 that I haven't looked closely at yet.
I think it's the Mahomes thing is interesting. We look at the playoff challenge last year, and I think about 80% of all the teams were either Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen at quarterback. This year, it's still about 80%, but Josh Allen owned in about two to one, 48% to 24% on ownership percentages between those two quarterbacks this year. You're right. Mahomes, not only was he 6%, he was behind Jalen Hurts as well. So he's the 4 quarterback this year, which I think is fascinating. Is he, I guess the obvious answer to this next question, if you have a favorite non-Kelsey Chief, it's Mahomes for you, right?
For me.
Is that the same way that you would play it in the playoff challenge too?
I'm assuming that Josh and Lamar will carry 70 to 80% of the ownership again. If that's true, then yeah, I think Mahomes is an obvious pivot from Kelsey. I have a hard time thinking, unless you think Casey's losing to Houston, which I don't think anybody does, then I don't see how Worthy or Hollywood Brown or Pacheco or Kareem Hunt or any of these guys possibly outscore Mahomes over 2 full games. And Mahomes has looked hot. He's gotten hot, and he's healthy, and he's fresh, and the whole team's healthy.
Is there something to be said for Xavier Worthy or Isaiah Pacheco as a playoff of Kelsey and Mahomes? Is that something that you'd look at? I think that the thing is with maybe Worthy's the play if you think the Chiefs are going home early, but if the Chiefs get to the Super Bowl, I'd like to think Pacheco will be a big reason they get there. And because of Kelsey Mahomes, not a lot of people have Pacheco.
I would have no problem playing Worthy or Pacheco in the $35 contest. I think, like with the larger field, I think you almost have to try some of that to try to cut through to the top of the rankings with a contrarian take like that. Pacheco, I'd worry about. Hunt's been really involved. Worthy, I really like. Rookie receivers coming on late in the season, classic thing you're seeing, and he's got Patrick Mahomes finding him. So to me, Worthy's a huge breakout candidate. He could take all the, not all the work, but he could take a lot of the ceiling from what people are expecting out of Kelsey. I do agree with that. And I've, as I was playing with it the last few hours getting ready for the show, I did find myself on a couple lineups that did include Worthy that I thought made a little bit of sense in the $200 contest. And I say that because in this contest, with only 8 spots available, it's really hard to avoid duplicates. So you really do have to start thinking about at least one position where you're way off the board, or at least on the third or fourth option on a team that most people won't play, to try to separate.
In the playoff challenge 1, we saw Pacheco owned in fewer than 1% of the teams, and then Xavier Worthy was at 16%. So those are good plays if you're looking for Chiefs not named Kelsey or Mahomes for sure.
Hard to dispute that, at those percentages.
Yes, exactly. When you look at the team that Kansas City's playing this weekend, the Houston Texans, Nico Collins, I believe, I'm going to look it up right now, just because I don't want to just be talking out of my rear end here. Nico Collins was the most owned Texan in the playoff challenge 1. He came in at 39%. The next closest Texan was Joe Mixon at 13. I'm wondering, since the Texans are significant underdogs in this game against Kansas City, if you believe Kansas City's moving on, as I think most people will, is Dalton Schultz actually an interesting pivot off of Nico Collins, or could you see Mixon having a good game? Sometimes I bring stuff like this up and it just gets shut down right away. Like, we're not playing Mixon. We're not playing Schultz. It's going to be Collins. I'm going chalk here. But I think because this is tight end premium and because it's a positive game script for Schultz, he maybe is a little bit more interesting for me. How are you seeing the Texans in this game?
Yeah, I initially, when I was thinking about the Texans in this contest, I struck Schultz right from my list. And then as I was building lineups, I realized that tight end, you could potentially win with the contrarian option for sure here. Kelsey's going to be obviously highly owned in playoff number 2 as well. I don't like Schultz at all. I'll be plainly honest. I don't like him. I don't think he's a dynamic player. I think he makes mistakes in the field. But I do see your point, in a 1-game contest where Houston's likely to lose and Nico Collins is probably going to be more like 60% plus this time around versus week 1, because people had the option to fade Houston. And there were some different iterations you could go with in the last contest that you have to pick one now. He's going to be way chalkier than last time. Now, Joe Mixon has I would say a poor matchup, a road underdog running back against a strong run defense. So I think Joe Mixon's going to have to get there in the passing game, likely. But he is a guy who can explode for touchdowns and he can catch passes. So I wouldn't count him out. But when I did look more closely at it, I thought it's not crazy to think that Schultz could catch like 8 passes for 75 yards and maybe sneak in the end zone. Maybe those are a little bit high numbers, but and then Mixon could just get shut down and get 8 points for you. And so, I don't like it at all, but if you're trying to look for, especially in the $35 contest, I'd say you should try that once or twice.
Yeah, Schultz is a nice flyer. I mean, the $35 that is the flyer contest where you can get away with that. If you were, and I think you're in the $35 playoff challenge too. How many flyers per team are you looking at there? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it more?
Interestingly, I didn't spend much time thinking about that, but what I did do is I took 2 of my lineups. I took one of my Hurts and one of my Mahomes. I put it in directly the same as I had it, but I knew it would be duplicated in the 35, even though I was hoping it wouldn't be in the 200. So I swapped out Justin Jefferson for Jordan Addison, and I didn't make any other changes. And that's how I tackled the 35. I'm probably out of it there because I'm probably not off the board enough, but I'm more confident in my $200 lineups. But that was how I handled it. But I didn't put a ton of thought into it. Playing $70 worth of entries there.
Exactly, yes.
And they were free entries. They were from Best Ball, I think $5 Best Ball wins or something like that.
Oh, house money. That's even better.
Exactly. So
we'll see what happens with that.
And actually, the reason I didn't play more is because it filled.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, that's right. That one filled. I was going to say about 12:30 Eastern on Saturday. That one filled up for sure. Which, ironically, and I was talking with the other FFPC people, almost to the minute. At the same time last year, which was really bizarre. I think we were like a minute or 2 off, but when it sold out. So that's a Saturday afternoon game, Houston at Kansas City. Let's get into the Saturday night game when Washington goes to Detroit. Jaden Daniels is a guy that I don't know how you feel about him, but he has surpassed my expectations pretty much all season long. Every time I think he's done winning or done making plays, he makes more plays. Same thing happened in the opening round of the playoffs as Washington went down to Tampa, upset the Buccaneers, and now they get a date with Detroit, a game that many people are counting the Commanders out of, and maybe rightfully so. The Lions have had a week off. They're healthier. Their defense is looking better. They're going to get David Montgomery back. But Jaden Daniels has laughed in the face of a lot of that kind of adversity all season long. How interesting is Jaden Daniels as your quarterback in this competition, knowing that instead of 12 spots, you only get 8 spots here, and you might want to be a little bit different? Could the Commanders make a run? How interesting is Jaden Daniels to you?
Jaden Daniels has my favorite aspect of any athlete, and it's killer instinct. He has the ability to come in at the moment in time. It's the same thing Patrick Mahomes has. When it counts, he's very, very difficult to stop. We saw that last week when it counted again in the most important moments. Obviously, Baker Mayfield's fumble helped the cause for them there, but the fact that he was able to come down, put the winning points on the board in a tight game on the road, it just proved what we've all been seeing all season, that it's real, and he's a great player. When you talk about the contest number 2, I'll say unless you think Washington can win this game, you probably shouldn't play Jaden Daniels in this contest because you're going to get outscored substantially at the quarterback position, especially with the Super Bowl being worth double points. If you think Daniels can win this game and at least get through the NFC Championship, maybe you could look at the math and make an argument for a quarterback that plays in 2 weeks. If you have a Saquon Barkley maybe, or somebody else who you think can really put up like 40 points in the Super Bowl or something, whatever that looks like. So I would, and I will say, when I built my first lineup, my first instinct, I clicked Jaden Daniels, and that's where I started my lineup because I thought, this kid could beat Detroit next week. Absolutely. Detroit's defense is decimated. I know they played well, but look at how Sam Darnold played this past week again. And so does that really mean Detroit's defense is playing well, or does that mean Sam Darnold crumbled when it mattered most? And so I think Jaden Daniels could put up 35 or 40 points, and this could be the shootout of the century here coming up.
And if it is, I think if it's Washington, you kind of want it to turn out in a shootout, because if that's the case, that means you're in the game late, and maybe you just need a couple of plays from your quarterback to win the game. And that's all Jaden Daniels been doing all season, is making plays in the fourth quarter. So it could be very interesting. Now, I think we're talking about Washington potentially upsetting Detroit. Let's talk about the odds-on favorite for the NFC Championship game, Philadelphia versus Detroit. I think you said earlier you actually like Philadelphia in that game. Why do you like the Eagles to beat the Lions in Detroit if that game shows itself?
I think Jalen Hurts will be back to full strength by that point. I think the Eagles' defense is incredibly superior to Detroit's defense. And I think the Eagles offense can easily keep up with the Detroit offense. So to me, it's a matter of the defense just being so much better for Philly. I think that Philly's an experienced team. They're going into a dome. It's not a scary environment, so to speak. They're not going to Buffalo in the cold or something like that throws a huge wrench in the gears. So to me, Philly's got every weapon in the world on offense. They seem to have their act together. AJ Brown's reading book on the sidelines. Like, I don't know what happened to him. He went from screaming mad to Zen reading a book during the game. So something's happened with Philly. They seem to have it together from an emotional standpoint that they didn't last year.
Yeah, I said AJ Brown was just curling up with a good book and a football game broke out around him. That's basically what happened on Sunday afternoon. I wonder if that does happen, that means Detroit's only playing 2 games, and it means they're not getting to the Super Bowl. If you do think Detroit falls short of the Super Bowl when you're building these lineups, and I'm saying you, Daniel, as well as anybody else who is in a similar position, if they think Detroit is not winning against Philly, does that change who you pick as your Lion? Does that make St. Brown and Laporta more playable rather than Goff or Gibbs?
My favorite play of week 1 of the FFC playoffs was St. Brown. I think he came in at 34%. Everybody was getting on to Gibbs. I put Gibbs in my lineup when I first started clicking, and then I looked at it and thought, there's no way I can play Gibbs at 50+% versus St. Brown at 30 something. St. Brown's probably actually more likely to outscore him with Montgomery back over a 3-game sample. So I'm just waiting for, of course, St. Brown on all 5 of my teams. As far as this week goes, well, in the 200, again, with the amount of duplicated lineups that you're expecting, I think St. Brown, even if he's at 35-40%, becomes somebody you want to think about if you think Jaden Daniels can beat them, or if you think Philly can beat them, to think about even pivoting to a Jameson Williams or a Sam Laporta, where they're a little further off the board, but in a 1 or a 2-game sample, if these teams really key in on St. Brown, and if Gibbs and Montgomery split some work, you could see one of those 2 guys hitting a ceiling, and that could be the difference for you in a contest like FFPC 2.
The opponent for Detroit on Sunday, no, we already talked about them. Let's move on to Sunday. I want to talk about the Rams and Eagles here. Yeah. I think when we were talking about the Rams at the start of the season, it was a 3-headed monster for players that you wanted to get early on in drafts. It was Kyren Williams, it was Puka Nacua, and Cooper Kupp, not necessarily in that order. As the season has gone on, all 3 of those guys have flashed. They've all looked very good at certain times. However, at the end of the regular season, and now against Minnesota with just 1 catch, Cooper Kupp, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's age. I don't know if he's dealing with something. I don't know if Nacua and Williams are just that much better of options for Sean McVay to move the football with Matthew Stafford. I'm not sure. We know that in the FFPC Playoff Challenge 1, Puka Nacua was owned in 74% of leagues. Kyren Williams was owned in 17%. Cooper Kupp, 2%. Now, obviously, Cooper Kupp is a nice little pivot play in the $35 competition to be different, especially if the Rams go down to the Eagles on Sunday afternoon. What does Cooper Kupp mean to you in the $200 level? Is that getting too cute, or is there something there knowing that, hey, maybe it's just a Kupp game against Philly, and the Rams go out, and all of a sudden Kupp is going to be the correct Ram to own in the divisional challenge?
Oh man, I'm not going to be able to click Cooper Kupp. He's just been, I think his average targets over the last 6 games is 4. I mean, if you're going to get 4 targets out of any player, I don't think you can play him in this contest. I would play Tyler Higbee before I played Cooper Kupp in FFPC 2 contests, because he fills a more unique position where if Travis Kelce busts, anybody could win that position. And Higbee's healthy this week, and everybody forgot that because he got hurt last week.
Right. And I think what it was, I saw something today. McVay said he was there. He was coughing up blood or something, and he went to the hospital, but now he's good to go, or they expect him to play this week. So that'll be, and Higbee looked good in that game against Minnesota. Look, if you would have told me that was Laporta, or that was Kittle, or anybody like that, the way he was moving out there, he looked really good, and Stafford was looking for him too. So I think that's interesting. I definitely agree with you. I think Higbee over Kupp, if I had to pick one or the other, I think that's going to be very interesting. Nakua, 74% were owned him in the playoff challenge 1. How do you handle a guy like that? Because he's going to be owned in a lot of leagues again. Do you feel like kind of hamstrung, like you have to take him?
If it's 73-18, I'm taking Kieran Williams every time. I don't care what the game script is. I don't care what the opponent is. So I'm actually disappointed with myself in last week's contest, where I think I have 2 out of 5 Puka teams and 3 out of 5 Kieran, because I was trying to hedge, and I was maybe about 15% off on my guess on the ownership. And when I saw the ownership, I just rolled my eyes and went, "Oh man, I should have played Kieran on every team. That was a mistake." So I will do the same thing this week if that's what it is.
Right. And that's the great thing about the playoff challenge too, is you can rebound from those types of decisions and go with your gut and make the correct calls, the calls that you wished you could have made last week, for sure.
For sure.
Eagles, AJ Brown, we already talked about his book reading. He did have a quiet game as well. 1 catch, 10 yards, I think. Now, the Green Bay defense, I think, has been underrated. They've been playing very well. Jalen Hurts had not played. He had not started a game in 3 weeks coming into this game. So I want to give Green Bay's defense credit, but I also want to understand that Jalen Hurts now has a full game behind him that he just played. So you would like to think he's dialed in. I think you alluded to that earlier. But how much does the fact that he was so quiet against Green Bay affect who you want to take from Philly if you want to play off of Barkley, who was, I mean, my God, what was his ownership in Playoff Challenge 1? 69%. So if you don't want to go with Barkley, how do you feel about A.J. Brown knowing what he did this previous week?
Yeah, so I think that if less people are playing A.J. Brown, then I want him more in my lineup, very simply put. I think a quiet week just means a guy like that's ready to explode the next week, squeaky wheel in the dressing room, whatever it is. He's going to be asking for the ball, and he's a great player. So I would play A.J. Brown for sure in this contest. That said, I would also start a lot of teams potentially with Jalen Hurts based on what we already talked about. The other quarterbacks are going to be chalky, and Hurts is going to be somewhat of a pivot. He might be a little higher than that 9% this time, but he's still probably going to be in your 15%, and that might be pretty good for Jalen Hurts. So, but I'm not afraid to play A.J. Brown. If he's 3% owned, I actually want him more than if he's 10% owned. 15.
And this is interesting too, because I happen to agree with you on a lot of this. I'm kind of curious, is there a quote unquote chalk guy that you do want on your teams, or are you trying to avoid it as much as you possibly can, no matter the player, no matter the team?
I wish I had studied this contest a little bit more over the years. And I think actually I'm having a lot of fun with it this year. I'm assuming I'll probably play it again next year in a similar fashion, 5 or 6 lineups in that 200 range, and maybe if I can get in early enough, I'll be able to play 15 or 20 of those free credits in the lower level contest and try to play some more flyers. Talk about chalk. I don't know what the optimal. I'm sure there's people who have studied what is the optimal chalk to play in this 8-player contest. I have to think it's not more than 1 or 2 where you really want to separate. But I haven't looked at historical results. Maybe it's 3 or 4. If you get off the board a lot with your remaining picks, I'm not sure, again, what the optimal combination is. But when I look at this, this specific contest, if Josh Allen's 50%, obviously he could score 40 points this week, but I would just not play him because you're not gaining any leverage when he does hit. And there is, out of 8 other quarterbacks, someone who's likely to compete with him. You just have to figure out who that is.
Yeah, and I think that's another part of the game. That's another part of the theory, to try to figure out not only the correct combination of players, but the one that is going to not be duped in a contest with only 8 slots that you can fill in. The big game that everybody's excited about, Sunday evening, I think it's a 6:30 Eastern time kickoff when Baltimore visits Buffalo. Now this Baltimore team is dominated with or 2 players dominate this team. It's Lamar Jackson and it's Derrick Henry. We do have Mark Andrews, who's been scoring a lot of touchdowns. We should have Zay Flowers back this week. I don't know if we've gotten anything definitive on that. Maybe he's playing, maybe he's not. I quite frankly, I don't know. On a team like this, is Rashad Bateman in play if you want to stay away from Jackson and Henry, who were super owned in the playoff challenge one? The Ravens are a very interesting team for this approach, Daniel.
So I was operating under the assumption Zay Flowers was out. If there's news on that, maybe
I'm going to look it up right now.
Caveat my comments, but I don't think you could play Rashad Bateman unless you have, like I said earlier, maybe you have 4 or 5 really chalk pieces in the $200 contest, and you're trying to find a guy who's like 1% or less that separates maybe in a 1-game sample in a loss. If you think Buffalo is going to win, I could see maybe doing that. Otherwise, if you got a little bit more spread between chalk and between leverage guys, then maybe you could play Bateman a little more easily in the 35, where you kind of need a guy like that, or you're not going to win. But I'm not excited about playing Rashad Bateman at all. No. And I like Rashad Bateman from a dynasty standpoint. I'm still one of these guys who believes in putting Bateman on my dynasty team for a 3rd-round pick. But in this particular contest, I don't see how I could play him, especially in the 200.
Just curiously, I know Bateman was a 1st-round pick, I believe, in the NFL draft.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
What is it? Is it the draft pedigree? What do you like about Bateman? Because I know the FFPC, as far as dynasty rosters go, they are kind of shallow when you have to get to cut down. What is it about Bateman that you like, that you're trying to acquire him on those dyno teams?
I'm probably gonna have to cut him on some teams because have some deep teams and he's not going to make it, and I'll probably sell him for a 3rd or a 4th or whatever is the going rate. Not that I want to. I'll definitely collect him back in the draft if I can, if he's sitting there. I think he had a good draft pedigree. He had a pretty athletic profile, and I think he looked like kind of like a Keenan Allen kind of player. He's always had really good footwork. He can get open. He can create separation. He's just not been healthy consistently, and he's not been on teams that have a high pass rate. So it's been you've seen him flash, though. This has been a pretty good year for Bateman. You've seen him flash when needed. He's stepped in and played well. I just don't think from a fantasy standpoint, I think he's a better real life player than a fantasy player at this point.
My whole thing with Bateman is I recognize the talent, and I recognize that this isn't your older brother's Ravens where receivers used to go to Baltimore to die. That's not the case anymore. And I do think not only can the Lamar Jackson and that Ravens passing offense support a receiver and a tight end, I think they can support a second receiver as well. The problem I've always had with Bateman, and I do have him on 1 or 2 dynasty teams, just never know when to start him. I mean, obviously, if Flowers is hurt, if Andrews is out, well, then you get the Isaiah Likely train going. But the thing is, it's like there are games where everybody's healthy where Bateman will pop off 5 for 92 and a touchdown, and I just don't know when they're coming. Like it's like dynasty best ball. I get it,
right?
But it's tough in redraft.
I was just going to say that you just reminded me to make a note to make sure he's on every one of my dynasty best balls, because that's the kind of guy you want in that format for sure.
For sure. Yeah. The final team that we'll bring up here, Buffalo. James Cook and Josh Allen are going to be the 2 dominant players as far as ownership goes. If I said that you were not going to roster either one of those players on any of your teams, which Buffalo Bill are you most likely to roster instead of those 2? Is it Dalton Kincaid? Is it Khalil Shakir? Or is it perhaps somebody else?
So if you're not playing Josh, either you're looking for leverage or you expect Baltimore to win. So I would say, in a 1-game sample, I would take Shakir for sure, especially in a game against the Ravens, where I think you're going to see, again, if you expect them to lose, them playing from behind. So I kind of like Shakir in that format. For some reason, Dalton Kincaid can't separate from Dawson Knox. I don't know why. And sadly, I had a lot of Dawson Knox in like round 17 of best ball drafts this year, and he didn't really do much throughout the season except for take away from Dalton Kincaid's production. And he did pop a couple times, but didn't really help my best ball teams. But when you look at the snaps, when you look at everything, I don't know. Everyone expected more from Kincaid, and for some reason, he's just not getting the ball enough.
Do you think it's like Kincaid's not the issue, right? Like this is a Joe Brady, this is a Josh Allen, this is an offensive thing.
They're running the ball so much, right?
Right.
I mean, and that's definitely part of it. It's a little bit of the syndrome that Bateman has, right? So Kincaid could be suffering from that, but again, he's he's not running a whole lot more snaps than Dawson Knox at the moment. And so now I could say one thing, if you're looking for leverage, if you're going to play maybe like multiple tight ends, try to get really creative in this FFPC 2, then maybe Kincaid comes into play.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know people have done that in the past. I'm trying to think what tight ends would be viable for this. I mean, obviously Kincaid, Mark Andrews. You already said you are not a fan of Dalton Schultz. Kelsey.
But I can see the point. I can see
right,
why you'd play. Right. Ertz is probably secondary chalk. I managed to land on him last week in 2 teams. I'm still not sure why or how, but if he gets me a few touchdowns this week, I'll be happy.
And you like Higbee. Laporta is obviously a guy that's not going to be the highest owned line player, probably not in the top 2.
I like Laporta specifically if I'm playing Jaden Daniels, because then you're playing the Lions to lose, and Laporta could put up 30 in a loss and hit over the other guys on Detroit.
What about, where does Dallas Goedert figure into this? He got into the end zone last week too.
If you think Philly's going to lose to the Rams, which there is a case, there's not a bad matchup for the Rams against Philly. They do match up well if you look at it just across the board. So you could potentially argue that, it's a closer game than one might expect. And if you think the Rams win that game, then you could definitely play Dallas Goedert in a single game, and then he fills your tight end position, and then you just hope for Travis Kelce to bust, and you might have a winner.
I have to look back in the history of the divisional playoffs in the NFL. I'm really surprised at the point spreads I'm looking at right now. They're fairly high. Chiefs 8.5, Lions 9.5. Eagles are the second closest game. Eagles Rams is the second closest game of the week. Eagles are a 6-point favorite in that game, and then obviously, and this is interesting too, the Ravens are a 1.5-point favorite in Buffalo. That surprises me. That surprises me. And that could change. Now, the Bills did open as a 1.5-point favorite. I don't know what switched the line on this, that all of a sudden the Ravens are 1.5. I did want to bring this up when we were talking about Zay Flowers. John Harbaugh, this would have been yesterday afternoon, said they are in, quote, "we'll see" mode when it comes to Zay Flowers and whether he's going to be available. He said that he doesn't need to practice in order to play. And he says he will play if he feels healthy enough and it's safe for him. This is like 50-50 at this point. Like and probably more closer to doubtful than probable in this game, to your point earlier. So we'll see what happens. But here's the thing, Daniel, even if Flowers is going to go, we're not going to know until Sunday night, right?
You can't play him.
And you got to have those lineups locked Saturday afternoon. You got to stay away.
Unless you're in the 35 and you're really just praying for the lottery there, I don't know how you play Zay Flowers. And when that line moves like that, it actually makes me, and I was already leaning this way when you asked me good chalk, bad chalk kind of question, and I said Josh Allen for bad chalk. I would say almost Derrick Henry might be in the good chalk category. You can run the ball on the Buffalo Bills. I don't know if they've cleaned that up yet, but Derrick Henry is going to test that. And he's going to test it aggressively. So I don't mind that line movement. Actually, it's an outdoor game. You don't want to play against Derrick Henry outdoors. And if Baltimore controls that game flow and runs more plays, that could be big trouble for Buffalo and anyone who picks Josh Allen. So those are kind of correlated, good chalk, bad chalk. Obviously, Josh Allen could make me look real bad real fast.
And I know we've kind of been dancing around this topic for most of the show here. But the biggest difference in preparing for the FFPC Playoff Challenge 2 this week for you, Daniel, as opposed to prepping for the Playoff Challenge 1 last week, where there's more teams, more players, bigger lineup. Now that gets shrunk down from 12 to 8. We went from 14 playoff teams to 8 playoff teams. And obviously the player pool shrinks quite a bit as well. What's the biggest difference in your approach to prepping for building lineups in each of these competitions?
So given that there's less roster spots to consider in week 2 of the contest, you really have to think more about how you're going to get unique. So your combination of it's more like a DFS tournament type of situation where you really have to avoid those duplicated lineups that just aren't going to win you the money when you do win. And so you really have to think about those leverage spots. You do probably have to get deeper with your plays. We mentioned Tyler Higbee, like that, it might be a 5% owned play, but that's actually something I would strongly consider here in this contest because nobody's going to play it. And if he puts up 15, 16 points, that might actually be all you need at the tight end position when you consider how weak tight end actually is across the board in this contest outside of Travis Kelce. And we already talked about how guys like Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Pacheco could take a lot away from what we've seen from Kelce in the past. So now flip that around, and given that there's no real appealing tight ends, you could run a 3 tight end team and just get really creative and try to pick 2 tight ends from teams that lose this week, along with Kelce or maybe one of the other guys you like, or run something that might be a little bit different. 4 running backs, 4 wide receivers. I don't know what's going to be the chalk between those 2, but whatever it is, run the opposite. Have a look at high owned receivers, high owned running backs. If it looks like people are going to go 4 wide receiver, go 4 running back. That alone will just add to your leverage.
I normally, when we do the high stakes fantasy football hour on Friday nights, my co-host Farrell Elliott will ask this last question, and he will say, it cannot be a player that we've already talked about. It's got to be somebody new. I am not that stringent when it comes to this, because we have talked about a ton of non-chalky players tonight, including one twice that we just discussed again for the second time in Tyler Higbee. Daniel, if there is a non-chalky player in the FFPC Playoff Challenge 2 that everybody should really roster, I guess I should ask just your favorite. Is it Higbee or is it somebody else? And then conversely, a player that's going to be owned in a lot of lineups that should not be in there. And I guess with your approach, maybe all of those guys should not be owned. Like the good chalk definitely being circled around and outnumbered, the bad chalk being or the good chalk being outnumbered by the bad chalk in this competition. So I'll ask you that. Non-chalky, your favorite non-chalky player, and then a player that people are going to have, but they shouldn't.
I mentioned earlier the Detroit guys. If you think there's any chance Washington wins, I think Jameson Williams and Sam Laporta are awesome pivots off of guys that are going to be heavily owned in St. Brown and Gibbs. So to me, those are probably my 2 favorites. I can't count Tyler Higbee as a favorite. Sorry. And then what was your other question? Who's chalky player?
Yeah. Because you looked at the ownership for Playoff Challenge 1, and there are some players on there that I know you would not want to roster at all. Who's the player that is going to be super owned that you think is not the right call to make?
I think it's probably Jahmyr Gibbs, and I absolutely love Jahmyr Gibbs.
It's the Montgomery factor, right?
It's the Montgomery factor. He could get 40%, 45%, 50%, 55% of the snaps. Right. We don't know.
Yeah.
And to me, that makes Gibbs a very risky play with 4 other guys around him, 5 with Goff if you really wanted to play a Detroit Super Bowl.
I feel like if the Lions are making a deep run, if you look at what the Lions have done with their offense when both Montgomery and Gibbs have been healthy this year, you get a lot of Montgomery in the first quarter, right? And then they kind of unleash Gibbs to end the half. Gibbs will usually take over in the third quarter, or he'll still keep being the prevalent running back in the third quarter. But then in the fourth quarter, a lot of times when the Lions are trying to salt the game away, you will see more Montgomery than Gibbs. And if you're talking about a guy who is all of a sudden going from being the only guy except for Craig Reynolds to a guy that's going to be sharing carries and catches with another guy who is a proven bona fide star, that is a tough pill to swallow. And I think you're right. I think you just got to stay away from Gibbs and go with somebody else here, especially if you think Detroit's losing. It could pay off with Jameson Williams and or Sam Laporta for sure. Daniel, so much fun talking. We got to do this more. This was a great show. It's going to not only set the table for anybody who's watching this to enter the FFPC Playoff Challenge 2, but I think you gave a lot of good dynasty advice tonight too. And we're basically on the cusp of dynasty. We're in dynasty orphan season. It'll be dynasty startup season before we know it as well. We will continue to follow you on the X at Daniel Priestner. Thank you so much for hopping aboard tonight. Enjoy the remainder of the postseason, and good luck with all of your lineups in both challenges that you've already entered and the 2 challenges you've entered for this weekend as well.
Appreciate being on the show. Thanks so much. And don't expect to find anything from me on the old X. I just use
I know. I put that out there. I put that out there. You can follow Daniel if you want. I don't think you'll glean anything from following him.
Not going to hear much
from me. You could say, hey, I followed the guy who won the 500K in the playoff challenge before he won it this year.
Well, let's hope so. But fire me a message over FFPC and I'll respond for sure. So
there you go.
Nice to be on the show. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel. Enjoy your evening.
Good night.
Daniel Priestner, ladies and gentlemen, a guy who's won 162 FFPC leagues over the years. Always good to chop it up with him. So much fun. And I think we learned a lot on how the Playoff Challenge 2 is different than the Playoff Challenge, how you need to attack it differently, and what your approach should be if you want to win $100,000 in the Playoff Challenge 2 this weekend. The first step to doing that, going to myffpc.com, myffpc.com is where to go register for that $100,000 Playoff Challenge 2 for just $200. And you can also register for the $35 contest and still have a shot at a $25,000 grand prize there as well. Just looked at how far along we are. We're looking at about 10% full already. And I know it's only Tuesday night. These things like exponentially get more and more full as we go on. And we've already got, almost 900 teams signed up for the Playoff Challenge 2 $35 level. And that's like 20%. So that one's going to go fast. Get in while the getting's good over at myffpc.com. Remember, an 8-player lineup. You don't have to worry about fading anybody. You will pick one player from every team: quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, tight end, and 2 flexes. Check it out, myffpc.com. Going forward here with this show, this will be the last show we do weekly. We will now switch to a monthly format. So we will produce a new RotoViz High-Stakes Lowdown each Tuesday night. The first Tuesday of every month, we will have a fresh show for you. And we'll be focusing on early best ball tournaments. We'll be focusing on Dynasty. And then we'll get into the redraft season. And then obviously we'll go back to weekly every Tuesday coming up in the second week of September, I think, is when we resume the weekly show. So just monthly from here on out. I want to tell you that you can watch the High Stakes Fantasy Football Show on the Better Sports Network this Thursday, 7 until 9. It will be myself and Draft Sharks Jared Smola, who's done extensive work on the Playoff Challenge 2. If you're looking for some tips and tricks, watch that show, 7 o'clock on the Better Sports Network. Any of the FFPC or BSN socials will have it for you as well. And we will go through that and get you set, tell you everything you need to know. And if there's anything that slips through the cracks that we didn't cover, we will cover it Friday night live on the High Stakes Fantasy Football Hour at 10 p.m. Myself and Jay Farrell Elliott from the KFFSC are talking to the $200,000 runner-up in the FantasyPros Championship, Jarrell Ford. He will join us not only to talk about his team, but we'll get into some playoff challenge content as well. Jarrell Ford, by the way, never played in the FFPC before. Enters one team in the FantasyPros Championship this year. Only team he played all year, and it wins $200,000. People really do win at the FFPC. We'll talk with Jarrell on Friday night at 10 p.m. Thank you so much for listening, watching, streaming, downloading. Appreciate it. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, comment on the video, share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, and click the notification bell so every time we go live, you will be aware of it, which will be Thursday on the Better Sports Network, as well as the FFPC social, 7 o'clock, me and Jared Smola. And then this show will resume the Friday before the Super Bowl, I think. I'm going to double check that right before I get out of here. I believe the next show we will do will be Tuesday, February 4th. So that is before the Super Bowl. It'll be a Super Bowl preview show with a guest to be announced later. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Eric Balkman for Daniel Priestner. This has been the High Stakes Lowdown, RotoViz High Stakes Lowdown on the FFPC YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the High Stakes Lowdown, a RotoViz podcast brought to you by the Fantasy Football Players Championship. And thanks to Grapes for our theme music. Please review the podcast on iTunes under the RotoViz radio feed. It helps us find new listeners. Contact us via email, rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you think, and follow us on Twitter at RotoVizRadio. And remember, you can always support the show by subscribing to RotoViz at a 10% discount through the NFL podcast homepage, rotoviz.com, rotovizhigh-stakes.com/podcast.